I'm now going to introduce the moderator of our next panel. She's a professor here at NYU. It's Natalia Levina. She's the Toyota Motor Corporation Term Professor of Information Systems, Technology, Operations, and Statistics. She's a fascinating, incredible intellectual scholar and friend. So glad that she's here with us. Her main interest is in understanding how people span organizational, professional, cultural, and other boundaries while producing and using technological innovation. So her main research interest could not be more central to the topic of today's conference. So we're extremely lucky that she's here. And I'm going to turn it over to her now to introduce her other panelists. Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you, Melissa. What a great start. I truly enjoyed Hila's latest presentation. And I haven't heard it before. You guys getting absolutely the latest and greatest research. So that's great. It's my pleasure to introduce my two co-panelists. The first co-panelist, I hope, Chris, if you can turn on your camera, is Chris Tucci. He's a longtime friend and a fascinating researcher. Chris is currently in the Imperial College London. He was on faculty here at Stern, and many of us still miss him. He has his PhD from MIT Sloan School. Chris is a leading researcher on crowdsourcing, especially from strategy perspective. So kind of continuing with some of the themes Hila brought in. Chris is leading the Center for Digital Transformation now. Some of you who have taken MBA classes on innovations might have been exposed to Chris's earlier book on digital model transformation. And his more recent book on crowdsourcing, I was a part of. It's a great book as well. Chris is a fun person to talk to always. And today he will be covering the topic on the strategy level of governing distributed innovation. Take it away, Chris, and Melissa. I'll introduce Melissa Valentine right before her talk, so it stays fresh in our minds. And my talk will be third, and we all will hopefully leave some time for questions. And thanks, Melissa, for keeping us on schedule, so we'll have time for Q&A. Chris, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Natalia. Great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Let me try sharing my screen, see if I can pull this off. I am at home and I just got my internet connected 3 minutes before I started. So I was tethering to my phone for 3 weeks. So let's hope. I hope you can see the screen. I'm going to talk a little bit about distributed innovation and crowd governance today. And so I will explain what I mean in a minute or two. Actually, it's a little bit about me here, but the one thing I wanted to mention, thank you for the intro. And I didn't tell you about this, but I'm working on a new campus concept right now for Imperial College. So we have a new campus area in White City in London, and we're going to have cross-faculty, cross-school within Imperial collaboration on AI, data, and digital. And so we're working on that. I'm actually one of the co-directors of it and working on all the education programs for that. So it's kind of a very exciting development that I've been doing, working on for the last year and a half. Okay, let me jump right into this crowdsourcing governance type question. So just to lay the groundwork here, I wanted to talk a little bit about open innovation, just to say, open innovation's got many different aspects to it, many facets to it. And this is, from Henry Chesbrough's book, you can see the different, the boundary of the firm here. There's lots of things that happen outside the firm, and then there's many things that happen inside the firm. And, the whole point of the book was to make people aware that they could do things outside as well as inside, in addition to, just to reference a little bit of Hila's talk there. And I think what I say will be very, very consistent, I hope, is a complement to what Hila was just discussing. So, you might have corporate new venture groups, a spin-off, a spin-out, you license things in, et cetera. This is sort of time passing, or this might be the progression of the projects, university research, corporate venture capital. And then over here, you've got this big one on distributed innovation. And I'm going to zoom in on that a little bit and think about how we could have different different aspects of distributed innovation. This is firm-sponsored stuff, obviously. And I'm calling this a temporal sequencing because basically I'm thinking of this like an upstream on the left and downstream on the right. So, you know, you could have, and it's mainly outside the firm. That's why you see it below this little dashed line here. But of course, you could always have an internal idea contest. A lot of companies have them, you know, very interesting. You could also have a hackathon that spans internal and external, maybe something very upstream to come up with some new ideas, sort of a very, very compressed crowdsourcing exercise. And then, you know, the one that a lot of people studied, including myself, studied the most, is you could have a kind of crowdsourcing for problem solving. In addition to that, you know, as you move further and further toward the market, you may actually have something like crowdsourcing for marketing or crowdsourcing for demand. You know, this is the kind of thing like a threadless type argument where people propose designs and vote on them, and then they kind of know which designs are the most popular amongst the crowd, and then they basically turn around and sell those same designs to the crowd. You know, so you're basically trying to figure out the demand as opposed to coming up with any kind of basic R&D or any kind of applied R&D. So, you know, as a slight explanation for this, I mean, this is a little paper I wrote with Alan Afua almost 10 years ago now. And, you know, this is I'm going to call it a sponsor right now. We called it a focal agent in that paper because, you know, you're on some kind of knowledge landscape, let's just say as an analogy, and you want to get to the highest peak in the knowledge landscape. And so you want to have, you know, access to these other people, B, C, and D, for example, and they are going to be well placed to do local searches around where they are. And so this one, D here, could get you a very, very good solution exactly where you want to be, but you can't get there yourself because, you know, you're too constrained by your current knowledge, by the people you have, the training they have, the skills they have. So it's kind of like making a local search, you know, for these guys into a distant search. So in other words, making a local search for A in some sense. Okay, and I'm going to come back to this picture later because I'm going to question when we don't have a sponsor, what do we do? So basically here, I'm adding a new parallel oval. And I'd like to differentiate between sponsor organized and crowd organized innovation. And so basically all we've been talking about so far have been really oriented toward a focal firm, you know, or sponsoring an idea and trying to get as much input as possible into their own process that they then churn out and take to market. And what I'm proposing here, something I've been working on quite a bit lately, and to various degrees of success, but I'm actually I would be very happy to get your input and your questions here and see how we could think this through a little better and improve it. But basically saying that, you know, you may not have a sponsor, you may not need a sponsor. Maybe there are some circumstances under which a self-organizing crowd could actually be very, very interesting for innovation. Even if a firm would be to benefit from it, maybe you don't need to control the crowd in such a way. So that's and I don't think it really doesn't have anything to do with a lot of the other things that we talked about when we talk about distributed innovation. It's really kind of a different dimension, I would say an orthogonal dimension. That's why I pictured it like this. So, you know, what does crowd organized means? And this is the paper I've been working on with for a while now with my former PhD student, Joana Pereira, and my colleague, Gigi Viscusi, who's at Imperial College with me. And we're trying to basically understand, what does it mean to have a self-organized crowd, you know? So far, we've come up with the following list. And they're not completely independent of each other, as you're going to see in a minute. But, you know, one thing is that norms could be emerging, you know, so it's not so obvious how interactions occur and how behaviors occur. And people who have studied, you know, offline crowds, I mean, real world crowds, always say that, you know, if you feel like you're anonymous in a crowd, or even if you're not anonymous per se, but if you even feel a little bit anonymous because you're in a crowd, you might have more so-called deviant behavior, which brings, you know, which I really enjoyed that discussion that we just had, you know, saying what is an error here, you know, and this doesn't have to be a machine generated error. It could just be more variance, you know. So what I think of as more deviant behavior could be more creative behavior, more creative ideas. on the other hand, it might be something that's antisocial or illegal or something like that. But I would say probably the variance of the ideas, would tend to grow if you have a self-organized crowd. The scaling could be higher. Typically, if you don't have a gatekeeper, now that's not always the case. Clearly, you could have an open call and try and get as many people in the crowd in the world to participate. But on the other hand, if you have a LinkedIn group that's by invitation only, that's going to do brainstorming for you. I mean, that's not got a very big growth rate. That's not a very high scale. And so what I'm arguing here is that it might be more scale. It might have bigger scale and be more scalable. And on the other hand, you may have more democratic decision making. So in other words, the sponsor isn't going to call all the shots on what people are going to work on, but rather, or even the problems that are posed. So the crowd itself could turn around and decide what problems are interesting and what kinds of solutions would be interesting as well. Now, when we talk about what is an error or what is deviant behavior, I think this is a great example, and I'm sure that most of you have heard of Boaty McBoatface. But if you haven't, you can search for it online. It's a very, it's it's a very funny story. But it also, and the headline in the New York Times is "What You Get When You Let the Internet Decide." So, the idea was, hey, let's throw up a challenge to the whole, to anybody, and let's see what they come up with for the name of this prestigious, sophisticated, new research vessel in the UK. So that was the basic challenge, and people came up with names. And at some point, someone said, how about Boaty McBoatface? And then people latched onto that and started voting for it. And originally, they had decided that they were going to literally take the winning, like the one with the most votes was going to be, that's how they were going to name the boat, which is actually a mistake. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. It kind of relates to the question by Isabella from a few minutes ago. So in the end, they had to solve it. So this name did win, but they declined to name the whole boat Boaty McBoatface. They decided to take one of the sub vessels on there, a research vessel, and call that Boaty McBoatface, and they called it something very sober. I can't remember what it was now. In any case, what I'm trying to do here along the bottom is trying to articulate roughly a kind of a very closed, I would say, or a very controlled or firm sponsored process on the left, and moving all the way to the right, we have more of a crowd driven process, let's just say, so incentive, threadless, we talked about these all the times. Sapiens, idea contests. Then you've got, your current stage of Wikipedia, which actually is, and this little logo here is the actual original logo of Wikipedia. And I would say that Wikipedia was actually fairly crowd driven at first. It was a kind of crazy Wild West, of anybody putting anything they want in there. And then over time, they kind of put controls and made editors and voting and, and made much more of a structured process out of it. And then, you've got your things like 1 Billion Minds, which was a very interesting site for global social challenges, and people could propose projects and people would work on the projects in the crowd. And then maybe over here, you've got something like Bitcoin or some kind of cryptocurrency where the constituencies themselves, decide how they want to migrate the entire system, if at all. So I think there could be a very interesting range of options here that incorporate less and less firm sponsored control. And that brings me to this landscape. Now, we haven't had very much traction with this so far. But what we were thinking was, here you have these people on a landscape, and you've got this focal agent, the sponsor is deciding, what the problem is. And so they somehow the knowledge landscape is laid out for them because of what they decided they wanted to work on. And these peaks are representing different ways that you could approach the problem, let's just say. And so you have people scattered all over the landscape. But what if these different people scattered all over the landscape could themselves decide what problems to work on? And would that make a more rugged landscape? I imagine it could. Would there be more interdependencies? Probably. And so I've been trying to think of different analogies of how a rugged landscape, searching on a rugged landscape, could change if you could have the crowd itself determine the problems and the solutions. So now I just wanted to kind of conclude here with some different implications for outcomes. You can see crowds will present different types and degree of organization. And so I'm going to go from, crowd organized over here to sponsor organized. And then I'm going to think of an outcome of this, which would be the knowledge generativity. So as I was saying before, if you have a crowd organized, you're probably going to have more so-called deviant behavior. You might have more so-called errors, but actually that might give you some crazy inspiration or some crazy idea that you could then run with at some point. So, what we're arguing here is that your knowledge generativity is probably going to be higher in a crowd organized situation than in a sponsor organized, and you'll have less so. I'm not saying it's zero, just probably lower amount of generativity from, very firm controlled outcomes. And this could trace out a kind of a, what we're calling, what we have called the generativity frontier here, where you've got, like along the frontier, you're efficient, and within here, you're inefficient because you could either go this way or this way and improve on one dimension or the other. So for this amount of generativity, you could probably have a much more controlled environment for your crowd. And up here, we would just say it's impossible because you can't go beyond the edge of that frontier. So implications here. So what are the risks and costs of misunderstanding? So misunderstanding a type of collective. In other words, depending on what you want to do and what you want to get out of it, and maybe even a sponsor could be interested in seeing what the crowd works on itself. That could be interesting. So even if they're not controlling the crowd. So, you might overvalue or underestimate the amount of investment, the kinds of output that you think you're going to get from a crowd. The crowd characteristics may lead to more or less knowledge generativity. And, the higher the level of centralization, the more control the sponsor exerts over the crowd, probably the lower the knowledge generativity of the crowd. So that's all I wanted to say about this. I am happy to hear any feedback or ideas that you have for improving this. It's kind of things that in progress for the last couple of years. We've been thinking about this, and it was a very nice opportunity for me to collect my thoughts today. So thank you very much. Look forward to the rest of the panel and to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's great talk. Again, brand new stuff, so very exciting. I wanted to ask that our audience can put in questions into the Q&A, but we're going to move on to the next talk, and we'll have time for joint Q&A at the end. With that said, it's my great pleasure to introduce our next panelist, Professor Melissa Valentine from Stanford. I also have a pleasure of knowing Professor Valentine for many years since she was a PhD student. She's now a tenured associate professor at Stanford University Management Sciences and Engineering Department in Center for Work, Technology, and Organizations. Her research is fascinating and spans multiple domains, which is rare. I got to know her work when she was doing stuff on better organization healthcare teams, looking at how to better organize emergency room departments. She then extended this work to working with oncology clinics, but later working with others at Stanford, she has pioneered this idea of flash teams, which we're going to hear about more today. And now Professor Valentine is working on research on the use of artificial intelligence technologies in organizations with diverse experts. So I can't wait to hear her talk, and please welcome Professor Valentine.
Thank you so much, Natalia. It's great to be here. I actually want to start with a selfie and a story. This selfie is the day that I met Dana Lewis. As the caption reads, Dana Lewis is the sort of innovator of the artificial pancreas and the open innovation community that sort of innovated and produced this. So Dana has diabetes, and she wanted her insulin pump to work more like a pancreas. But there were not any companies who were developing that product, despite a lot of user demand and a lot of user need for it. So she and an open user innovation community produced it. They developed it and they produced it. So now many people have artificial pancreases. You can see one, you can see hers, it's actually attached to her body, like pictured here. At the time that I met her, so when this picture was taken, artificial pancreases were still not being mass produced by companies, but still innovated and produced by the open user innovation community. I think that her story and sort of her vision is what draws a lot of you here to this great conference organized by the great faculty and staff at NYU. She saw a need that was not being filled by current solutions, by current companies, by current offerings. And she looked outside of the firm. She looked at distributed resources, distributed expertise, and figured out a way to sort of bring those together and combine those in a really new way to produce this thing that has been very beneficial to a lot of other people. So I think that's what's really exciting about what we're talking about here today. I think that's what kind of the shared vision of this conference is, which is great to be a part of. So my sort of piece of this and what I want to invite us to kind of think about while we're pursuing this vision together, I want to talk about the crowdsourcing platforms in particular that make this possible. And I actually want us to focus specifically on looking at the structure of work on the crowdsourcing platforms. So the crowdsourcing platforms, to put in the language of the other panelists, these are outside of the firm. These are drawing together people who are outside of the firm. I want to look at the structure of work on those coordination platforms and think about how the structure of that work enables or constrains different kinds of innovation. When I talk about work structures, often we're thinking about bureaucratic organizations. If you've been in a big organization, I'm guessing that you have been a part of, possibly pitched a reorganization. If you've ever said, you know, we should have more boundary spanning, or we should have more cross-functional teams, or maybe we should try a matrix structure. If you've ever said any of those things, then you have thought of work structures. You have an intuitive sense of what structures support what outcomes. So we're taking that kind of thinking, that way of thinking about work structures, and we're going to apply it to crowdsourcing platforms. To sort of introduce this idea and kind of like tune our analysis towards this, I'm going to kind of walk you through a research conversation that was happening at the time that my collaborators and I worked on the idea of flash teams. So the conversation that was happening in the crowdsourcing community at this time, so I'm thinking of like sort of academics who work on crowdsourcing platforms and kind of innovate what's possible using crowdsourcing. So this was the research conversation that was happening at this time. I think that this community, like so many of us and so many of the other panelists and so many of you, all see how computation and sort of like networked labor is just fundamentally changing the way that we do work. So I won't belabor this point, but I'll just say the specific aspect of this that we were focused on was open call sourcing. Meaning when you have a piece of work, when you have a challenge, when you have something that you would like done, you can sort of source it, you can solicit participation online from anyone online who's sort of in the network. So open call sourcing changes the nature of work pretty fundamentally. At the time that we started our research, crowdsourcing was largely focused on micro tasks and algorithms that integrated the micro tasks. So I have sort of stylized images here of what those micro task workflows might look like. These might be familiar to you by now. So this would be if you're ever labeling an image, or if you sign into reCAPTCHA, for example, when you're signing into your email, that's a micro task. So most of the crowdsourcing platforms at this time were structured around micro tasks. And what was really cool and innovative at this time was that the micro tasks could be algorithmically combined. So when you have a large group of people all contribute a small task, you can combine all of those tasks in really kind of innovative and cool ways. So this was mostly the crowdsourcing conversation at the time. So again, taking the analysis or just taking the sort of like work structure, this is a lot more akin to an assembly line where you have pre-specified tasks, predefined, laid out, and then automatically combined in predefined ways. The achievements of this way of structuring work have been foundational and important. This is how we got a lot of the machine learning images that support AI. This is how a lot of the sort of like writings and books have been transcribed that are now available through Google. You can also see that these can support really cool, innovative, real-time services like supporting question answering for somebody who can just post this, and then you have a lot of people available online to sort of work on this. But the crowdsourcing community at this time was recognizing a challenge. It's cool and it's interesting and it's innovative because it's happening online with all of these really cool platforms, but it actually is a classic work design problem. The problem was they were wanting to accomplish much more complex goals using crowdsourcing, things that are more interdependent, that require new ideas, combining things in new and novel ways. So at the time that we did our research, this is where the conversation was sort of staying. It was remaining where all of the the more complex innovation was kind of out of reach. What is pictured here is actually a crowdsourcing paper where the crowd was working on designing a new chair. And you can see that the designs sort of like go back and forth between things, and it just didn't converge into something that actually ended up working out. So what we saw and the conversation that we sort of had in our team is that this was a classic work structure problem. If you have a really open-ended and complex goal, like producing or innovating a new product, it's really hard to articulate, modularize, and predefine all of the tasks that will be involved and all of the behaviors that will be required for that kind of complex work. So our sort of problem statement is that crowdsourcing at that time was confined to goals that were so predictable that they could be predefined. And our question, our vision was, can we use the same kind of open call platform approach to crowdsource something that was much more complex and much more interdependent? I'm going to add a comment here to sort of connect this to some of the other panelists. I think the way I would think about this is we're looking for production that is outside of the firm, but we're going to draw on some of the coordination structures of the firm. We're just going to apply them sort of outside in the more kind of open community setting. We thought that this vision was the way to sort of create or sort of advance what was possible with open innovation, with more sort of networked models of drawing people together and supporting their coordinated work. So I'll now sort of describe the platform that we designed and deployed in a proof of concept study. As an organizational scholar, what's really interesting to me about all of this is some of the structures that we innovated are pretty classic. I love that in the paper that we wrote about this, one of the novelties was actually hierarchy, which if you think about it, is one of the oldest management structures you could possibly imagine. But hierarchy allows for different kinds of coordination than like an assembly or a microtask workflow would allow for. So our vision was to create a platform that supported an alternative crowdsourcing architecture, something where the crowds were structured more like organizations, but still drew on the speed and scale of crowdsourcing platforms. So I'll give at this point really like a nod to organizational scholars and organizational theory. A lot of what we drew on to design and test our platform we drew on from a lot of research on temporary organizations. So people have done really great studies of movie crews or incidents command or some sort of like disaster response team. These are similar to what we were envisioning with Flash organizations. These are These are basically like crowds that come together temporarily and do something very complex and very emergent and very innovative. So the question that scholars took to these was to ask, what makes this possible? What makes it possible for a group of strangers to show up and coordinate something so complex and something so interdependent? So the answer that was consistently found across all of these studies is that people drew on their roles, their expert roles. So when somebody shows up to a movie crew, they know who the director is, they know who the gopher is, they know who the gaffer is. So they all show up knowing who they are and what they're supposed to do, and those roles help them know how they're supposed to coordinate with each other. The second really important piece besides the roles was the hierarchical structure. When you have a hierarchy, it's clear who is supposed to issue the next decision. Some sort of emergent something comes up and someone has to respond and issue sort of an adaptive instruction at that point. That's what hierarchy enables. So we wanted to design and deploy and test a crowdsourcing platform that embedded the idea of role structures and hierarchical structures into the platform. So this really great, fun, amazing group of PhD students, master's students, me and my collaborator, who's a faculty in computer science, we had a couple of really fun years designing this platform and deploying this platform that allows for basically designing Flash organizations that have these role structures built in, that have the hierarchy built in, but still support automated hiring that we expect from that sort of on-demand hiring and open call that we expect from crowdsourcing. The sort of technology version of role structures, I guess I'll say, is that the platform interfaces with the labor market at the level of, or sort of around the role. So if you're wanting to hire a UI designer, then you would put that into the platform, and then the platform interfaces with the labor market to find a UI designer. So that's now introducing role structures into the crowdsourcing approach. This is how we allowed for hierarchy to drive adaptation in the crowdsourced organization. So basically, this is the platform visualized here. And we configured it so that it could be edited by anyone, basically. And from a technical point of view, this is simple. This is very straightforward. This is like what GitHub does. So basically, you make a copy of it, make an edit to it, and then merge it back in. So here they've added another team member and another task, and then they merge it back in. And now the whole team can see that this change has happened. They can see that the organization has adapted. There are a lot of different ways you could configure this. For our proof of concept, we ended up configuring it so that these suggestions had to be approved by a manager. So it ends up being a very hierarchical way of sort of adapting the organization over time. But we had fun thinking about ways that you could do this like in a democratic way, or there are different decision rules that basically could allow the group to think about whether or not to adapt in particular ways. The final piece that I'll note about the platform is that it did continue to support this open call hiring, because the platform interfaced with, at the time we did this research, with Upwork, which has millions of workers who are registered. So it interfaces with Upwork and it issues an open call to people who have the particular role that you're hiring from. For our study, we configured it to be first come, first serve. And there are lots of things to talk about with implications of that decision. So to sort of conclude, I'll just say we did a proof of concept study where we recruited people outside of our research team who didn't have experience with crowdsourcing, who didn't have technical production experience. And we gave them the chance to use this platform to crowdsource something complex, to lead a complex project. I've listed here what the projects were. There's lots of documentation online if you're interested. I'm happy to provide more detail. But the proof of concept was largely successful. Our users were able to basically crowdsource entire organizations, which we defined as 30 people. So they convened 30 people in 6 weeks, and they were able to accomplish their really complex projects. And they hired their workers in 14 minutes on average using the labor market. Here's a description of the complex deliverables. And now I'm just going to sort of illustrate what was produced. What I'm trying to show here is just that they were complex. These would be very hard to crowdsource with a different infrastructure, obviously. These are the workflows that emerged. This is basically like a stylized image of what was designed on the platform. These are tasks. Each of these little squares are tasks. These are the emergent organizational structures that were produced. And then finally, here are sort of the important statistics that sort of proved our proof of concept. This is the average hiring time for each organization. And then we also just counted the number of times that somebody requested a change to the organizational structure or to the plan. What I'm illustrating here is just, indeed, these projects could not be predefined. There needed to be a structure that could be very adaptable as the work progressed. So in conclusion, I'll just say the vision of this conference and what this research hopefully contributes is computational systems are really fundamentally changing the way that we work. The point of view that I wanted to offer is to really think about the way that we structure the work and how that helps us accomplish certain kinds of goals or possibly constrains other ways of accomplishing that work.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Fascinating. I love this work on Flash teams, and anybody who has tried to build anything on Upwork that involves more than 2 people should appreciate what you've done and use this stuff. So great work. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears and present some of my own work. So Professor Tucci has talked about strategy and big questions of like which type of crowds one should involve. And Professor Valentine talked about structure, and I'm going to bring it back to management. Now, my own work in the last sort of 10 years has focused on crowdsourcing. But over the last 20 years, I was interested in issues of boundary spanning. And as many of us are switching to remote work in the last year and a half, I realized that some of the stuff I've been thinking about for 20 years might be actually relevant above and beyond what I've been studying in crowdsourcing. So I'm going to try to go back in history to some of the work I've been doing on crowdsourcing. So to go back to this idea that my colleagues already shared, which is the idea that innovative ideas don't just fall from the sky, nor necessarily sourced by a lone genius sitting in a single room, but are rather coming from the integration of diverse things from different spheres of life, as, for example, is the case if you look at the books that were published on the topic of innovation, you see things like Borrowing Brilliance or Medici Effect, with Medici's being famous for integrating diverse types of art and science to come for innovative outcomes. Now, to bring this a little bit closer to business, you might have heard the story of how the Ford assembly line was invented. Henry Ford visited plants, especially meatpacking district meat plants in Chicago, saw the idea of a moving assembly line and introduced it into the production of the Model T Ford vehicle, which resulted in the time being saved from 12 hours to assemble the vehicle to 93 minutes. So, you know, one could kind of say on the surface that Ford invented the assembly line, but as many of my colleagues already argued in this conference, I would argue that Ford brought in the idea of assembly line into the automobile production and had to do quite a lot of work to make it happen. And that's the point of my talk. Like, what is that work of boundary spanning that needs to take place to make these things happen? So when you think about like what happens today with the idea of boundary spanning, technology is basically enabling us to combine these diverse ideas across the globe, right? So we have enterprise social media and Zoom that's supposed to help us like dial in anybody, anytime, right? To tap into diverse expertise. We have the idea of global work, right? If we don't have expertise locally in our team, we can, call Japan and get that expertise from there. We have online communities like Wikipedia that Professor Tucci talked about, where people from very diverse backgrounds work together to innovate. And we have crowdsourcing, has been mentioned many times, where you often pick people you innovate with, or they self-assemble or decide to contribute to your problem, right? So technology is enabling this at scale. And why is this an important piece of it? Well, because my colleague, Professor Schilling, leading this conference, wrote an amazing book about how this type of integration of diverse ideas for innovation can happen inside an individual genius, right? So she writes about Elon Musk and about Einstein and others. But I'm going to argue that in the day and age in which we live, there's too much deep expertise you need for a lone genius to integrate it all. And as a result, you need to build a team around the project, and you do need technology. Unfortunately, technology does not make this happen. It only enables it. It still takes management and skill to make this integration happen. And even more unfortunately, we have this ideal of integrating diverse expertise across boundary, but the reality is, and that's based on research of many people studying organizations, that the ideal does not happen, and instead teams with more diversity tend to perform worse in studies than teams with less diversity. And here I don't mean racial diversity, I mean all types of diversity, professional diversity, tenure in organization, belonging to multiple organizations. So when you think about having a lot of diversity to deal with, it's more likely that people will fight. And as Professor Neely, who will give her keynote later today, writes about in her book, create fault lines where people align across the aisle and kind of stop talking to each other. So with that said, what can we do realistically? Well, one thing we can start thinking about is the rewards of actually making it happen. Organizations that are able to build capabilities that consistently integrate diverse expertise across this expertise boundaries, tapping both on internal expertise and, as Professor Tucci said, external expertise, tend to gain competitive advantage. So while this is very hard, it is worth doing. So I'm using Apple here as an example of a company that has been successfully integrating design and technology. At the very least, if you want to add to it marketing as well, you can. But two very difficult things to integrate well. It has been doing it for years, since the very first computer to today, right? And doing it well gives them this long-term advantage that is very hard to replicate. Now, with that said, let's look deeper into what it takes to be effective in boundary spanning. So one way in which organizations tend to address this is by relying on individuals, people like us, who end up being boundary spanners, who end up doing the work of connecting, translating, and integrating diverse ideas. So as you see, these individuals become critical to organizational success. And I'm sure many of you listening to me now are thinking, I am one of those people, right? I am a person who is able to integrate, connect, and translate these ideas. Now, the one thing we know about these people in these roles is that actually very few are able to perform these roles well. More often than not, people who are nominated to be boundary spanners, they're seen as somebody who is put in position as a team leader or project manager or even senior leader to integrate this diverse expertise for innovation. Well, the number one thing that happens is these people become very stressed and psychologically uncomfortable, because what they are asked to do is to basically belong to multiple camps and to none deeply enough, right? So to be an effective boundary spanner, one has to belong, at least partially, to multiple groups of experts. And but at the same time, to never take one side fully, right? To keep negotiating. Yes, I agree with you, but let's look at this side of it. Maybe designers are right here, maybe engineers, maybe salespeople. And in fact, they talked about salespeople tend to be one of those boundary spanners, and it's well known that their job stress is extremely high. Now, on top of needing to do this sort of being in between person, these people also need to have sufficient expertise and credibility to speak to multiple groups of experts credibly in their language and with expertise, right? So it's often that we are good at two things, right? Maybe three. But in modern organizations, we tend to be in this position of boundary spanners where we need to have at least some expertise in 3, 4, 5 domains. And not only that, but credibility to speak to people in these domains. So finally, let's imagine you achieved it all. You worked through the stress, you have developed this expertise. Well, now you become this primary communication channel and sometimes even a bottleneck, right? There is a ton of stress in this position when you do it well, because everybody relies on you to do this knowledge integration. Good news is, so that's the bad news. The good news is that once you are able to cope with the stress, there are actually rewards. And research literature documents that those who are able to integrate diverse expertise and practice, broker knowledge, connect people and do it well, basically enjoy the sort of innovative outcomes that I talked about, like the example I've gave of Ford, like people do, say, Edison was able to integrate these diverse ideas. And then for, more regular organizational members, not Edisons of this world, there are usually career advancements associated with being able to fulfill this role. So this is my most important slide. And I am going to slow down and talk about what I learned over my 20 years of studying people doing this work. And you can think about your own organizational context, your own job to some degree, to think about what this translates to. I am going to use examples of things I study most often, which is new technology development projects. So the first thing that people in this position need to do is to figure out at any given point in time which difference in knowledge, or what I call boundary, is the key one to deal with, to span at this point in time. Now, this seems obvious, right? But if you slow down and think about it, I'm going to use an example of a outsourced strategic innovation technology development project. In this case, the first boundary that was most prominent, was most relevant for people to deal with, was the boundary between clients and the consulting firm, right? People come from different backgrounds, they don't share a lot of knowledge, so they sort of start struggling with whose expertise should be the main one leading the project. Obviously, clients have the money and the authority, but the consultants bring in the expertise that they're paid to bring in. So it's important that they have this leading role. Well, that's clear enough, but as I'll tell you that as the project progressed, this boundary between the clients and consultants became less important. Like, people were able to establish shared knowledge and shared understandings and work together. And the one between designers and technologists became more prominent one, right? And as they worked through and work across this boundary, the next one that became more prominent was the one between newcomers to the project and the old-timers. And these things are constantly in flux. So the number one question I recommend these people who are trying to do this well ask is, like, what is the current boundary, difference that I'm dealing with that's causing misunderstanding and tensions? The next thing is about cultivating shared identity and avoiding us versus them. It's easier said than done, but focusing on what we are doing together, we're building the system. It's very helpful to actually put a little excitement into this, like, we are doing something new and exciting. We're talking about innovation projects. To speak the language of we, actually using the word we as much as possible, even if people are not collocated, is very important. Focusing on shared interests. If we do it well, this is what the rewards would be. We will, revolutionize the industry, or we will just finish the project and build our portfolio, etc. Creating shared space is particularly hard in day and age when we're working on Zoom. Well, you can argue the virtual shared space is not so bad, right? You have your project repositories and you have your, GitHubs and shared spaces. And maybe the physical space is not there anymore. And that may actually be problematic, because the physical space is necessary to build the social space. So Professor Neely, in her book, which I will introduce later, talks a lot about sort of building the socials that we're now increasingly missing in this online collaboration world. Why is this important? Well, it's important because it helps us overcome the us versus them, right? We both see each other as human. The next critical thing is to build shared practices, by which I mean routine sort of things you do together, such as daily standing meetings or weekly meetings, and sometimes not just meetings, but just check-ins and sharing what you've done for the day, and shared language. And by shared language, I mean not English or Spanish or Russian in my case, but rather the specific language in the project that only people on the project understand and others don't. Now, I think working in organizations, you may be frustrated by, okay, these people in this project speak this language nobody understands, they have abbreviations, and they refer to certain PowerPoints. But that's exactly what needs to happen to integrate across this diversity. To have this language nobody else understands. It may be a bit counterintuitive, but that's what it takes to innovate. So to build something new, right, you have to have new language. And the last one that is sort of important by itself is to work to overcome power differences. Now, what do I mean by that? You might, if you're managing a team that is not about focused on innovation, all of the things I said above still apply. But sharing power is a critical thing for producing innovation, because what needs to happen is that people who are not necessarily in the high status or high power positions need to be able to be comfortable enough to challenge people in the high status position. And by that, I don't mean like organizational power. So I'll give an example again from my own work. So the project was led, that I studied for a year, was led by strategy team. And the strategy team sort of sold the project and defined the requirements with the client for 3 months, right? So even though the strategy person on the team wasn't the most senior person, in fact, was a very young person, this person became a de facto high status person, right? This person knew everything about the project. Later on, as the designers were designing the product, they were actually more senior and often won awards in their area. But for this project, their status was lower. They joined later and they were not heard. At some point, they basically gave up challenging as a strategist. And eventually the technologists joined, like the software people. Those were even less powerful, right? Because they were behind in time and they basically had hard time understanding and challenging everybody else because they were told, look, this is what we already decided. So the critical part here is to enable folks who are at this point in time in the low status position to challenge what's been done already, to undo what's been done already, and to challenge people in high power position. And finally, the last two steps are sort of meta steps, which is in order to deal with the stress I outlined and to stop being a bottleneck, it's critical that the number of people doing boundary spanning on a project gets larger. You have more people who are like you. I recently was hanging out with a friend who is leading a large team, and she was saying, I wish I cloned myself, right? So this is the idea. Try to clone yourself, spend some effort cloning yourself in a team like that. And finally, you have to constantly reevaluate which boundary is the most pressing one now, because as I mentioned earlier, the organizational boundary was a pressing one at the time when the project started, but it was sort of other boundaries, other differences between people that became problematic later on. So I wanted to share this one quote from one of my later studies on offshoring. This is a project where everybody was a software engineer. There was no expertise diversity. But as in many projects you guys are working on with global workforce, right? People in other countries, in this case, India, were contributing to this project. But the point again is this is a project focused on innovation, complex development in production of a brand new system. So, and this is a quote from a bank manager who I interviewed, who was working with the vendors in India, where everybody around this person told me they are the true leaders, true boundary spanners, enabling us to innovate. And by everybody, I mean both people in the United States and in India, where I went to collect data. So what he said is doing this stuff, complex development in India, is difficult because there are huge cultural differences, and not in a way that you think when about it when you go to classes on cultural differences. A lot of the people want to treat Indians as second-class citizens. He's talking about American workers here. My project manager and I have gone through a lot to make sure that that does not occur. If it occurs, you are shot in the foot as far as accounting and innovation with these offshore guys. It just won't happen. Innovation is something we're constantly looking for, but you do not find it unless you create it, unless you sow the seeds. So with that said, the last sad part is that it's very hard to do in virtual work. So this project, while it had virtual component, right, people were still around in offices. This is an older project. And it is particularly difficult to do in virtual work, not only because you're more stressed because the family is there, right, like in this picture, but because we don't have that social fiber to help us overcome these differences and see each other's actions as coming from goodwill, as opposed to sort of other places like arrogance and a lack of professionalism. And I am going to come back to the stuff on crowdsourcing to integrate with my friends here, Professor Tucci and Professor Valentine, to say that these things are particularly difficult when you're dealing with crowds. It's difficult within a firm. We already deal with a lot of diversity, but at least you know what expertise the experts are coming from. It's difficult with inter-organizational projects and alliances because you know which differences you're coming from, but usually on top of technological and expertise differences, you are also imprinting organizational differences. But it's even harder with crowdsourcing because you have no idea what differences you're dealing with. So if you guys remember the beautiful landscapes that Professor Tucci shared with you, right? You're kind of working around this landscape. You have no idea where this peak in the landscape is and what kind of difference is causing the high mountain there to get the answer, and you are not seeing the answer, because that's the idea of that graph. And with that said, I'm opening it up for questions to everybody. And I hope you guys have saved some good questions for us. So I stop sharing the screen. And Melissa, if you can turn on your camera so we can handle some questions. And let me start with a question. I think the first question in our chat is for Professor Valentine. So Melissa, fascinating material, right? And the question is, do you have any thoughts or work on Flash teams in a matrix organization? So with dual reporting structures, because, right, you described the one with more or less single reporting structure. It a little bit overlaps with my talk, right? So you kind of, it's one thing to deal with one difference. What if you're dealing with multiple differences? So I'm curious too, Melissa, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it made me laugh a little bit because it's some of my work is in like large bureaucratic organizations, and matrix structures are known to be so complex. They're so useful and they're so valuable and they're so complex. And then Flash organizations are complex because you end up with like adding IT and not being able to see each other, which just also makes it more complex. So I appreciate, Natalia, you're sort of noticing that like what's desired, I think, with this question is basically integrating in different ways across a lot of differences. But it certainly underscores what's really complex and what's really hard about innovation and about structuring for innovation. So I think what I can say based on the empirical data that we collected from all the times that we've run Flash organizations is that currently the boundary spanning happens in private messages, like it's all interpersonal DMs. So what I like about your question is it's the opportunity to sort of formalize some of that backstage interpersonal boundary spanning that's happening. So I think it's a cool idea. I've not tested it.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. Yes, interesting. Next two questions, I think, are for me. I'll kind of try to answer them almost at the same time. The question I see here is whether using facilitators for teams that have very strong expertise in project management helps. So I have thought about this question for many years. So thank you for asking, because I have observed teams with and without such facilitators or sort of hired project managers. In fact, the very situation I told you about at the beginning had such a person. And the problem, if you think about my long list of bullets and requirements for a boundary spanner, which relates to that second question, is that such people rarely have expert domain knowledge, right? So they usually know how to run a project, not the domain knowledge. And when it comes to innovation on a level of integrating domain knowledge, sort of diverse knowledge, they tend to not be very effective in my experience, because you really want the key sort of to boundary spanning for innovation is relating diverse expertise. It's not just running project well. So I find that, in fact, introducing such a person creates a new boundary. So now you kind of have a boundary that already existed and yet another one between somebody with project management expertise. That's been my experience. I think some of these facilitators know how to deal with that new boundaries they just created. But in general, I'm not a fan of this idea when it comes to innovation type of projects. Now, the second question is, how do you know sort of whom do you nominate and how do you know if these people are effective? It's $1 million question. When I teach cases about this, where you have a kind of real case, we tend to argue out who would be a good one, right? Like, so here is a protagonist of the case, and here is maybe an expert in this and that, and we sort of argue it out. And the reality is there aren't perfect ones. So what you end up with is extremely long list of potential criteria that such a person need to meet. No human being can do that. As a result, you start compromising to say, okay, well, maybe they're not going to know as much about software. We'll just focus on hardware and design or something like that. But the number one thing I learned from looking in this area is you have to check in. You have to, as a senior manager, keep checking if they're doing the job. And how do you do that is by talking to the team. You basically have to check in. And when you talk about global project, it's critical to talk to these remote people who are not in senior positions to see if they're heard, right? If the manager is enabling them to be heard and if they're teaching. The last piece I was going to say, we, for example, looked at whether immigrants are good for this job when doing projects with a country from their country of origin. And in a nutshell, is not very often they're good. If you're interested, I could refer you to a paper on this topic or some short summaries of it for practitioners, because immigrants bring in a lot of that skill, right? Like they can talk multiple languages, but there is a lot of emotional baggage coming with that as well. A question for Professor Tucci came in. So I haven't had the chance to read it yet, but I will now. So the findings remind me of the impact of formal versus informal firm structure on their innovation output. The more formal procedures, the less rate of innovation output. Your idea seems to me that as an extension of this relation beyond the borders of the firm. What do you think? Chris, I am going to take an opportunity and actually ask you to speak about your other research on the as well, if you don't mind, on the level of formal structure for innovation. The research you've been doing with Professor Shapira, I think, comes right in. If you don't mind answering.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. Okay, so there are different ways of thinking about this, indeed. It's a really interesting question. I think there could be a kind of analogy. So let me just talk about the analogy part where this is coming from, and then I'll talk about some empirical work that I've done in this area. So, so the analogy is, if you have kind of a formal structure that, people may be less willing to do things because they don't like the bureaucracy or they feel like they're being too controlled. And where I feel like in the crowdsourcing exercise, I don't think that there's a lack of willingness. I think that when you have kind of an open crowd, let's just say, that people will suggest things that are crazy, that might be crazier than they would have otherwise. So it's not this lack of. I think if you get a LinkedIn group and you say brainstorm, give me 100 ideas, and this is kind of related to what Hila was saying at the beginning too. If you say give me 100 ideas, they'll give you 100 ideas. So I think that it's not a question of them holding back. They're doing everything they can, but maybe the very organization of this thing is kind of preventing them from deviant behavior or completely crazy, ideas that might be interesting for other people. Now, thanks also for the prompt on the empirical work, because on the empirical work, actually, what I was doing is studying a little bit about the levels of hierarchy and how many so-called big ideas come out of these things, and looking at sort of cross-sectionally and longitudinally. But mainly cross-sectionally, the firms that happen to have more deep hierarchies tend to have more important ideas. And one of the arguments that we were making there was that there was more of a chance of knowledge recombination if you move up a hierarchy. So there could be a role of hierarchy. And we're just speculating at the end of that paper by saying, well, maybe there's an IT analog for this that flattens it, allows you to have a flatter structure, but that also allows for more knowledge recombination. So, what we were looking at was from several years ago, decades even. And back then, maybe they didn't have the same kind of IT platforms that we have now to do knowledge recombination. So maybe there's a role for hierarchy, in knowledge recombination. So that would be my, sort of reaction to this question. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Chris. I wanted to make a comment. I think for the last 12 years, I've been studying crowdsourcing. I think we're increasingly accepting that there is a role for hierarchy in general, right? If you look at Melissa's talk, right, you're basically creating a hierarchy on top of a crowd, right? And a lot of we see actually related to the question of ideas dying, right? The crowd produces ideas that eventually die. The questions that Hila got earlier, right? It is really, if you have a good manager, part of their job is to organize it in a way that they don't die, and instead, like I heard, and integrate it. And of course, I pretty much am talking about managers so in the reality. So I think we are kind of acknowledging now that crowds cannot do everything. They are super powerful, but when organized. Yeah. So question for Melissa, and actually fascinating question. So Melissa, your work tends to be on Flash Team in kind of software virtual space. The question is, how do you translate that into the things other than software development?
Yeah, that is a great question. Let's see. So the industry examples that I'm thinking through right now are not, let me look at the question again, I think are not hardware or manufacturing. So when you have an industry that has a lot of like physical equipment, I'm sure there's examples of that. I don't have one, I can find one. The ones that come to mind are like Artella, which has the platform and the like community of graphic designers. Gigster does it with software developers. Catalan does it with like business analysts. So there's like there are a lot of examples of platforms and knowledge workers. When I say things like this to my colleagues in my department who do more like industry, Internet of Things, they will remind me that there are oftentimes like data collection apparatus like on the physical devices. So then you can sort of like model the system that does include the equipment. That is not my expertise. I can try to find an example for you and post it on the conference stuff.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And we're right on time. We caught up. Thanks, Melissa. Earlier, Melissa, for saving us some time. So, I really enjoyed my colleagues' presentations, and thank you very much.
Thank you guys for a fantastic panel, and thank you especially Natalia for moderating and being in the panel and moderating, which I now realize is quite a hard thing to do because you're going between answering a question to try to scan the questions for the next one to answer. So lesson learned for me, but thank you so much for doing it. You did a terrific job.